Welcome to the Potential Leader Lab, where we explore how to create a better world for those we care deeply about by dismantling our delusions and acting our way into a different way of being. Now today, and I'll back up a minute, I'm Perry Moffmer, your host. And before I introduce the topic for today, I just want to talk about a word I used in the intro for delusions. And I want to make sure that we're clear that delusions and illusions are different things. And so an illusion is a misinterpretation of sensory info, like when you see, if you're in somewhere hot and you see waves coming up that look like water, that's an illusion because that's a misinterpretation of our sensory information. A delusion is an incorrect belief not grounded in reality or a false belief that persists in spite of evidence. And I think that's the real danger we have to worry about because our own delusions are the things that probably the only things, or most likely at least the most significant thing that prevents us from really self-actualization and self-transcendence. So with that said, we're going to lean into episode 62, Leading Through Failure. It is the Relentless Way. So we're going to talk about what I'll term relentless failure. And it's going to kind of fly in the face of our cultural obsession with success. Now, we seem to like success. We have a strong emotional attachment to being successful and to be thought of as a success, when in fact, I would say that's all kind of a lie. And it isn't to the point where we don't want to be successful, but I think we have to go back to two things: why we want that, and then second of all, how we measure it, because I think those two things are really, really important. And I'll go back to Dr. James Carse and his work on the infinite and finite games. Now, you might know the infinite game is popularized by Simon Sinek's book, but it was actually Dr. James Carse who came up with the concept. And it's a very interesting thing because if we look at it in the context of success, oftentimes we look at success as a binary thing, as a win-lose. That's a very finite approach to our life because finite games, as Dr. Carse said, are ones that have clear rules. We know what the objective is. We know what the parameters are. There's a timeline, and there's also a definitive end to the game, and there's a winner and a loser. Now, that speaks to almost a ton of stuff that we do, both athletically and leisurely. Any game that we play typically falls under those guidelines. But then he talks about this thing called an infinite game. And infinite games are poorly defined rules, and the only goal of an infinite game is to earn the right to continue to play, which, by the way, if we look at it objectively, is really where we're at with anything we do in business or our professional lives, and then also what we do with our life in general, because we're not trying to win in life, right? Despite, what people might tell you, we just want to earn the right to continue to play. And what's interesting is he makes the discernment that he says, Dr. Carse said, well, you can have a finite game within an infinite game, but you can't have an infinite game within a finite game. So when we talk about goals and things we want to achieve, there can be finite games within our infinite game of life, but those are only looked at, the wins and losses are looked at like moments. And I think that's really powerful. And I think it's healthy to look at wins and losses as moments of an infinite game. So I just wanted to kind of set it up a little bit that way and talk about the fact that I don't think failure is an option. I believe it's the only option if you want to keep pushing those limits, right? And there is a difference between what I'll call ordinary failure and relentless failure, because from a relentless standpoint, we know that we must keep going and that failing is a verb. Failing isn't a noun or a label, because what happens to things, we turn them into labels, which can be very dangerous. So if we fail a couple times and then we label ourselves a failure, now that's something we are, not something we do. And I think something we do is much easier to modify, change, or evolve out of than something we are. So I think let's go into the first concept of relentless failure, and that is failure as a commitment, not an accident. It's proof of effort. I mean, if you think about it, failure actually is proof of effort. It shows that we're trying. And I think that's the way we need to focus on failure, is it's proof of effort. And so as we continue to try, there will be failure, but failure is not fatal. And failure actually is the point of growth. We can't really grow as a person if we're not failing in some way, shape, or form, because what I view failure as is a learning point. Like when I get to the point of failure, I actually learn something. I'm gathering data points to understand where I'm at in this certain thing. And so if I try to avoid failure because it doesn't feel good, which I'll be the first to admit it doesn't, that means that I'm not going to find those points of learning. So from an existential standpoint, we aren't really afraid of failing. We're afraid of what failure says about us. And I think those are two very different things. So there's the act in which we fail, right? But then there's the perception of what that says about us that really is the thing that we're concerned about. If we really drill into it, are we concerned about the failure itself, or are we concerned about what other people will think of our failure? It's kind of like the example I give. If you've ever seen, and this is just a separate example, it doesn't have to do with failure, but it does have to do with the perception of what other people think about us. And that is if you've ever seen a parent with a young child, say a 2 or 3 year old, out in public, and the child's having a breakdown, the child's throwing a fit, for lack of a better term. And the parent is trying relentlessly, by the way, to try to calm the child down, get the child to stop, get the child to be quiet, all those things. And if you watch the parent, oftentimes, if you look at it logically, you have a 2 or 3 year old with their brain is nowhere near fully developed, and you're trying to reason and be rational with them, which doesn't work. And the more they get out of control, the more you try to control. I've asked this question hundreds of times for people. And if you think about this, and everybody's experienced this that has a child, what were you really concerned about? And when we drill into it, our concern wasn't about the fact that our child was having a fit. The fact of the matter was we were very concerned that other people were judging us to be bad parents because we couldn't control our child. And so again, we go back to, are we worried about failure as the event, or are we worried about what other people will think about us and what failure says about us? So when we look at it as acting our way into being, which I talk about a lot, failure is an act of creation. It's not destruction. It's not a negative, it's a positive. You're spinning something up, you're trying something different. It is by definition of act of creation, and it isn't. And we think about failure as like a detour. We think about failure as a stopping point. We think about failure as something that prevents us from getting where we want to go, when actually failure isn't the detour, it's the path. The only way forward is through, right? It's back to a little bit of stoicism here, where what's in the way becomes the way, right? So Marcus Aurelius said, whatever's in the way becomes the way. And so we really have to think about this and go, okay, failure isn't the detour, it's the path. Failure is the way forward. And you can either fail relentlessly on your own terms, or life will make you fail anyway. Like, it's going to happen. If you're trying new things, if you want to continue to move forward, it's going to happen. And so we either do it by choice and do it on our own terms, which I'm a big fan of, or we don't and we allow it to happen to us. So why is it critical? So point number 2, why is relentless failure critical? Well, I want to give you another kind of way to think about this. Think about failure not as a coffin, but as a crucible. So we often, failure, and it's horrible and we want to avoid it. So it's more like a coffin. It's more like death, something we try to avoid. Think of it as a crucible. So the original crucible was something they heated to high temperatures and melted metal in, right? So they would forge, in a forge, they'd have a crucible to melt metal and make it malleable. Well, think about that as a situation that forces change. So in failure, we often find the way forward. We find what makes us us at points of failure. I've asked lots of leaders this question when we talk about this, and I say, when did you learn the most about yourself, and when did you grow the most? Were there points in your life where things were going swimmingly and going extremely well, or were there points where you were experiencing a failure, and where did you learn the most? And 100% of the time, they come back with, well, it's always when I failed. When I failed, it's when I learned the most. Okay, well, what about trying to seek those things out? Explore, experiment, evolve. It's impossible without failure. That's the whole point of it, because experimentation requires failure. And the problem with there is no really such thing as safe growth. If you're not failing, you're not trying. So there's no way to grow safely. And failure doesn't teach on a curve. it just gives you another shot. Like it isn't like, you get a C for that. It's you failed. Okay. You got a failure F. It's okay. Like you're going to get another shot at it. And now you know how not to do it. And that's awesome. It isn't something to be avoided. And it really does build up what Angela Duckworth wrote a book called Grit. You can call it psychological resilience. You can call it whatever you want, but it's the ability to bounce back, right? It's that ability to come back and know that, okay, this didn't work, but I've got confidence that I can move forward. And the best way to fail less is to fail more. You fail hard, fast, and often because you get resilient and it becomes part of the process. This really is also, many things in our life follow this pattern because the things we seek to avoid are things really meaningful to us that we need, like feedback. And we see this repeated time and time again with both people and organizations and teams. The ones that do great with feedback are the ones that normalize feedback. They don't just talk about the bad things. They talk about all things as opportunities for improvement. They talk about good things. They talk about bad things. They remove the stigma attached to feedback because we're getting feedback all the time, because most people would assume we're only getting feedback when we need to improve something or change something, when the reality is that's not the case. The case is we want to normalize feedback, talk about all the opportunities, and talk about how we did in anything, because there's always going to be points of failures. It's typically not absolute. It's not going to be an absolute failure. We did something and there were points in it where there were points of failure, but overall we did okay. We still want to address those. All right. So here's what we do. We want to reframe. There's ideas here, right? So the ideas are, we talk kind of theoretically about failure, about what it means to us, how we react to it. And I think that there is an emotional deterrent here, because from a very young age in our educational system, we're taught to have right answers. And so we carry that into adulthood, never thinking that maybe that doesn't apply in life. And it does. It definitely does hinder us. It doesn't apply actually, but it does hinder us because we get set into the thought of we always have to have the right answer because being wrong doesn't feel good. And being wrong doesn't feel good, but only because we're taught that. So we can teach ourselves something different, because we don't believe things because they're true because we believe them. And the best way to break out of this avoidance of failure is to fail more, because we have to overcome the fear. We have to see that the stigma attached to failure isn't true, because we're not going, most of the time, I'm not going to say any time, we have to be safe, but in our lives as we try to develop and in work, failure is rarely ever fatal. And that's what our fear is. Our fear is either one, we're going to die, or two, we're going to be ostracized by the people that we care about, in which case we're going to die as well, because that's what our brain thinks, because it's running on outdated hardware or software. Our brain's running on, the way it developed up to about 20,000 years ago, 20 to 30,000 years ago, depending on who you listen to. So it's still operating in a hunter-gatherer environment in a tribe of 25 to 30 people. And so it still sees the world that way. So if you failed and were ostracized then, it was certainly death. And so it's understandable why we have a heavily emotional attachment to it. But we have to overcome that, because that's not our truth anymore. That's not the way the world works anymore. We can have failure all the time that isn't fatal, that does serve us well. It actually serves us. And again, it isn't a coffin, it's a crucible. So how do we build in a practical application for this? So what are some practical steps we can take? Well, number one, as with many things we talk about, reframe the game. Stop measuring success, start measuring attempts. So simple as that. Don't measure how many times you're successful, measure how many times you try. This is just, again, back to the old theory about activities versus outcomes. So if we stop getting hyper-focused on the outcome and worry about the activities we have to do, because by and large, like even if you establish a goal, and if you've listened to me before, I hate goals. But if you want to do that, understand. So you have a goal. It isn't the goal that matters. It's actually who you become along the way to achieving the goal that truly matters. So worry about that and not about achieving the goal. So number one, reframe the game. Number two, set failure targets. Actually have an option in there to fail X number of times, because the reality is if you fail that many times, you're probably going to succeed at some point. But stop avoiding it, right? Actually set a failure target. We used to do this with when I worked in sales. We had people who we'd have so many calls to make. Well, what we'd eventually tell everybody is we'd figure out how many calls and then the percentage of calls you needed to make. So we would actually focus in on get 20 no's, like get 20 people to tell you no. Because we knew if we could get people to focus on that as the game, they would get a yes, but they had to get the 20 no's. So the focus wasn't on getting a yes, it was on getting the 20 no's, no matter how many yeses they got. So you can gamify it a little bit. It's all in how you think about it. And then this will lead you to be able to do the third thing, which is deconstruct the fear. What's really at risk here? Comfort, ego, the way you look to other people. If you have a very solid self-image and you have a healthy dose of humility, this won't bother you at all. Because if humility is at the core of what I do, I know I'm going to fail, because humility tells me I'm not perfect. I don't have to show up perfectly every time. I don't have to be that person, that shining star that never fails. Because even, and I forget who said this, it was years ago, it's like, if you bat 300, you're probably going to get in the Hall of Fame in baseball. That's 1 out of every 3, right? So nowhere do we recognize people for perfection. If you look in every sport or in any game, any of those finite games, nobody ever gets 100% of anything. It differs with everything they're doing, but passer ratings, passing percent, completion percent, batting average, free throw, 3-point accuracy, all of those things, they're never 100%. Yet in our lives, we start out with that as the baseline. We start out with expectations that everything's going to be perfect. It's going to be 100%, and then anything less than that is failure. When in reality, that isn't the case. So just be realistic. The next step would be just have radical transparency. Lead the way with failing. Own it in real time. Like embrace it, because this is the other thing. If we say we want innovation, what we're saying is we want failure, because innovation requires healthy doses of failure, because you just keep trying things. And then assemble a failure crew for yourself. Surround yourself with people who will call you out on your cowardice when you play it safe. That's what you need. You need people there that'll hold you accountable for being a coward. And that's what cowardice is not willingness to take a risk. You don't have to take huge ones. You can take small ones. You don't have to break the bank here, but put yourself out there so you can normalize it for yourself. And then the last thing would be just momentum over perfection. Iterate, don't stagnate. So you want to keep moving forward, right? It's all about moving forward. It isn't about being perfect. It's about momentum. Now, I want to be clear on why this matters, right? And this will be the last thing I talk about. Why this matters is because it isn't us that we're judging. This is not a judgment on you. It's a call to action for survival and relevancy in a world that is changing at a pace we've never seen before. So I want you to think about this as a function of that. This is not just for the sake of doing it. This is not something you must do just for your own edification. This is to stay relevant and survive. And I mean survive as being relevant in a world. If you want to create a better world for those you care about, which is what I want to do and what I call people that lead, then we have to increase our resilience to failure in order to stay relevant in an ever-changing world. Because the pace of change on the outside is tremendous at this point, and there's nothing that says it's going to start getting slower. So with that pace of change, you can't afford to stay the same, because if you try to tread water, everything moves past you. So you have to keep up, and keep up means innovation, and innovation means failure, and failure means success at some point. So failure is inevitable. The only choice is whether you'll fail small and safe or fail relentlessly and become something more, something that only you know what you can accomplish. Now, what I'd like to do is have everybody go fail relentlessly, and that would be pretty awesome. So if you're ready to stop waiting and start doing, you're in the right place. Keep questioning, keep pushing, and remember, growth isn't comfortable, but also remember, comfort wants you dead. So I'll see you next time in the Potential Leader Lab.